So, what is design controls? Back in 1996, the FDA introduced the Quality System Regulation. And at that time, they also included a new section that was specific to design controls for medical devices. A lot of people think the FDA came up with this, but they actually just copied it. And the people that they copied it from are the people that were on the committee for developing ISO 1345 and 9001 at Health Canada. So when you actually look at the design control guidance document from 1996, you actually see in the footer reprinted with permission from Health Canada. So Canada's approach to medical device regulations is rather than trying to be the only one that does all the work, they cooperate with the ISO committees and develop it as part of that committee, and they leverage those standards. So they have to do less work on their own. They really take advantage of that international standards development process. So back in 1994, when ISO 9001 was developed, the general quality system standard, that's where design controls came from. Health Canada took part in the development of the different standards, adopted that design control methodology, and then FDA copied it. So that was where design controls came from. It wasn't specific to medical devices, it was just what was available at that particular time. And unfortunately, it hasn't evolved in a really long time, and it needs to. Now, one of the things that popped up along the way is a different diagram called the V diagram. But that wasn't until 2016 when they developed the ISO or IEC 62304 standard for the software development lifecycle. So that V diagram is the closest, I think, to how the design process really works. The problem with the design process is it was envisioned back in 1994 and 1996. That was a linear process, and that isn't how design normally works. Just like Thomas Edison developing the light bulb. When you try, it fails. You try again, it fails. After 1,000 tries, maybe you have a light bulb. But that's how the process really works. You try, you fail, you go back to the drawing board, and it's an iterative process. And that's what, unfortunately, our design control process that's in the standard doesn't reflect. We need an iterative process built in right from the start. So when people think linearly in terms of documentation, that's not really how it works. The document should be a draft that gets updated continuously until you get to the end. And the end, we're going to talk about a little bit at the end of this video, but the end is not what a lot of people think it is. The end is not when you finish verification validation activities. There's a lot more that occurs after that. There's even more after you submit your 510K that a lot of people don't even think about, but that has to happen too. So if you're watching a video from somebody or getting a training and they show you the waterfall diagram and say, this is design controls. Yeah, back in 1994, when they came up with a standard that wasn't for medical devices, that's what design controls were. But you want something better, something closer to reality. The V diagram's close. And I came up with this diagram here. I don't know if this is the right way to portray it, but this is how I came up with a diagram. It sort of looks like the V diagram, but over here I have planning and user needs. And I'm going to talk a little bit about user needs. So user needs are not just one person. User needs can be multiple users. Let's just take a simple device. If you are going to give a patient at a hospital a device and send them home with it, one of the users is the nurse. They're going to set the device up and teach the person how to use it. The doctor might be a user. If it's a drug device, it's going to deliver drugs to the person. Maybe it's an insulin pump or something. You might have a pharmacist get involved. So you might have a pharmacist, you might have a nurse, you might have a doctor, and then you're also going to have the patient. They're going to get trained and they're going to get sent home with it. So you have multiple potential users. So when you say, what are the user needs? Which user are we talking about? Are we talking about pediatric users or adult users? Are we talking about, people that are going to use it in a special use environment like an ambulance? Those are key questions to ask when you're thinking about user needs. And you might have more than one version of your product over time as you expand into new markets. You could also have your product is being licensed out to other companies that are going to integrate it into the design of their device, and your device is an accessory. That wasn't originally intended when you first came up with the design. That was something that evolved over time when your product became popular. So that's user needs. The next thing they talk about is the design inputs. A lot of people think of design inputs in a way that what they're really talking about is I have an idea for how to fix this problem. That's not a design input. If you're making a flashlight, and this is an example I usually use to explain it to people, when you have a flashlight and you need to light up that bulb, you need power to get to it. The design input for that flashlight's power supply is not a 9-volt battery. That's a solution. That's getting close to an output, a final design spec for that battery. But that's not an input. An input is I need X amount of power to get to the bulb to light it up with enough light that I can see. And what I need to see one place is not the same amount of light I need to see somewhere else. And not every flashlight uses the same battery, and not every flashlight lasts the same amount of time. And what I need to do for a battery that's going to be climbing up Mount Hood when it's minus 40 degrees is not what I need in the middle of the desert in the summer. So, what I need for a power supply, it really depends on the use environment. It depends on the duration of use. It depends on do I need slow and continuous, or I need something to give me a very short burst of power that's very strong. What do I need? And the best way to do that is to say, when I do this test, it will measure between this and this. So if you say, I need this much current or this much this many watts of power to get to this bulb over this circuit, that gives you a test spec. So now I can write a verification protocol that will fit that, and I can put a multimeter on and see if it measures that. That's what you want for a design input, not it's a 9-volt battery. The next step of the process, the one at the bottom here, right in the center of the V, the freeze. A design freeze is supposed to be a freeze where you don't make any more changes. Engineers like to make changes. They always are reinventing the mousetrap, trying to make it a little bit better, and they often don't even have a clue whether the customer wants it. But the whole concept behind a freeze is if you make any more changes after this point, I'm going to be in verification and validation testing, and I'm going to have to repeat that testing because you made a change, and that's going to cost me a lot of money. So that's why we have a freeze. It's not because it's required by the regulations, it's because it's practical for the business. I don't want to have to pay for this twice. The most expensive part of everything is my verification validation testing, particularly if I have a clinical study. So that's what freeze is all about. But this is when you approve your drawings, your specifications, say, this is my final design. You might even decide that this is the vendor we're going to buy it from. If you make a change to a vendor, that might change what testing you have to do. They might use a different process for how they make it, so you have to use a different test method. So whatever the details are for the specifications of that part or that component or that assembly, that's what you're specifying in your design freeze. Then we get into the next phase, which is the verification validation testing. So verification first, typically, and then validation. It doesn't have to be that way. It could be in parallel, but there is a reason why sometimes you have to do verification first. If you have a high risk device that's going to be used in a clinical study, and your clinical study is the validation process, you need to make sure that your device is safe before you expose patients to it. So in those cases, the IRB and the FDA are going to expect you to actually do biocompatibility testing, or at least provide enough chemical and physical characterization of the plastics and enough history about those plastics in the manufacturing process that they're confident that it's going to be safe from a biocompatibility standpoint, even if you haven't completed all the biocompatibility testing. Another thing is electrical safety. If you convince them with some documentation that this battery is really low power and it couldn't possibly hurt anybody, I mean, it's a coin cell, like one of these little things I have in my drawer here. Where do I have one of those? These things. This is not going to hurt anybody. We put them in a watch all the time. That's not going to hurt somebody. But a 9-volt battery will give you a little shock, and a car battery will knock you on your butt. So, depending on how much power it is, it could hurt somebody. So we worry about that. EMC testing, could it interfere with other things in that environment, particularly in an OR? That could be dangerous. So there's practical reasons why we need to make sure we do verification testing before we do validation if it's a clinical study. But if our validation testing is an animal study, it may not be as important because we're for instance, we're going to do a hemostatic agent product and we're going to have to euthanize the animal afterwards. In those cases, we're not so worried about the safety of it because we only worry about the safety of the user, not the safety of the patient in that case. Then we have cadavers. We're definitely not worried about them. They're already dead. And we might even not even be working with the whole body. We might only be working with a knee or an elbow. For those of you that have never done cadaver studies, I apologize if you're having lunch now. And then we also have in silico studies, and of course, nothing can get hurt there. It's just software. So we have all these different ways we could do validation. But if you're doing the classical clinical study with human beings that are being treated, you have to make sure that it's safe before an IRB will let you do anything, and same with the FDA. So those are the basic steps, and they occur over time. So we start back here where the planning is at the beginning and the validations at the end, and that's generally the direction time goes. But then we have these two lines, and this is where the iterative process comes in. When you have a verification test that fails, so for instance, I do a cytotoxicity test and it fails. If you did that test before you go on to the other biocompatibility test because they're more expensive, so, oh, I failed the test. I go back and I come up with a different spec or I come up with a different design input. So you always go back whenever you fail. You do a validation test. Oop, it didn't perform quite as well as I wanted. I'll go back. Let's say you're doing simulated use testing for usability. You adapt your instructions, you adapt your training, you adapt your user interface, you clarify things, you make it play around with colors and boldness, maybe change the direction something works, maybe make it smaller, make it some sort of mnemonic feature to it that makes it very easy for that person to tell the difference between up and down. So whatever you come up with during your verification and validation testing that doesn't work well, go back to the drawing board and fix it. Either as, oh, this is a design input we didn't realize was important, we'll add that input, or we need to change the spec, or we thought that was going to be enough of a spec, we need to make it tougher. We need to make the tolerance narrow, we need to have more power, less power. You never know. It depends on the indication. So those are the iterative processes where you're going back and changing things. Now now that I've explained a little bit of the basic theory of design controls, I'm going to give you a little bit of a definition of design controls here, and it's not as well worded as down in the description below. But one of the things that people need to get through their heads is design controls is not just design controls. It's a whole collection of methods that have to work together. So you have to not only learn design controls, but you have to learn risk management and software development and usability testing. All these things have to come together. So it's a collection of methods, not just design controls is one thing. Design controls is has to have these other pieces or it doesn't work. Number two, design controls is not a one-man show or a one-woman show. No matter how smart you are, no matter how much experience you have, if nothing else, you're biased, you're the inventor, and you're probably not the user. So, therefore, you want to make sure that you have a team involved here where maybe the customer would be represented or the user would be represented. Maybe you have a doctor on your team or a nurse on your team or more than one. Make sure that you have people that are specialists in those areas. So, uh, I've been working all this week with a client of mine where the inventor founder is not a software expert, but that's the most important part of his device is the software. So he has a whole entire software team that supports him. So that's a key part. And what's also pretty common now that wasn't common in the past is you have multiple companies collaborating together to develop something. Previous now companies outsource things to contract manufacturers and contract designers, and they hire software development firms and they hire usability firms. They don't do it all themselves. They hire consultants like our firm. Next, the needs. We talked a little bit about the user and how you have the different user groups. But when you're talking about user needs, you have needs of more than just the users. So it's sort of an antique concept to say we only have one user, but you also to think that you only have one need. You have the customer needs, you have the regulator requirements, you have the requirements of the standard, and you have stakeholders such as insurance providers. It's one thing to get it approved, but nobody will pay for it. What good is it? If you can't get your doctor or your insurance company to reimburse it, you can't afford it. The the hospital will only do surgery if they're going to get paid. So don't think of just user needs, think of needs more globally of the customer, the regulators, the standards, and the stakeholders. That's important. Next, I talked a little bit about a collection of methods. We also have a collection of standards here. I'm going to give you a little bit of history. Back in 1994, we came up with ISO 9001. The QSR and ISO 1345, the medical device version of 9001, those didn't come out until 1996 when the QSR was released. Next, we had 14971, the risk management standard. The first version of that isn't until 2000. So we only have the word risk showing up once in the QSR. The reason why is the risk management standard didn't exist. It's kind of hard to incorporate a standard that doesn't exist yet. So we knew risk was important, but it's not really embedded into that. It's much more prevalent now in the 1345 standard. We have a risk-based approach, but even then, risk is not used nearly as much as it is in the guidance document for 1345. Then we have 62304. That didn't come along, the software lifecycle management standard, that didn't come along until 2006. So we're really getting into much more recent times here. 10 years has passed since the design control standard, and we just came up with, oh, we have software. So for those of you that are doing software as a medical device, the design control regulations, the reason why it doesn't make any sense, because you software people didn't exist then either, according to the regulations and the standards. So there was no thought of you, just one little word. So that's why it doesn't make a lot of sense. Um, you really have to look at 62304 when you want to see that. And that's why we have the V diagram in that standard. For those of you that are wondering why all these usability things are required now and why they weren't required before, the usability standard wasn't created until 2007, so after software. And if you're wondering about these cybersecurity requirements, where did they come from? That standard, the AAMI TIR 57, that didn't come out until 2016. Now, they did have an HE 95 human factors engineering that came out earlier, but a lot of the standards that we take for granted now in 2022 didn't exist when these standards were when the earlier standards for design control were developed, and we really need to revamp these design control models so they reflect reality. They're iterative, they involve multiple disciplines, a very big team, multiple companies often that are being outsourced to. They're much more expensive than they used to be, much more complex. We're worried about more issues. They take longer, and it is definitely iterative, not linear, by any stretch of the imagination. And so those concepts of lean development of products that are in Eric Ries's book, those are how you should be looking at this. You add the functionality over time as you develop the product, and you get a minimum viable product, and you add on another feature, and it's iterative. And what you go to market with initially might not be the ultimate model that you want to be selling in the long run. So you need to think about those different things. For those of you that are thinking, what am I going to do in the future? If you're trying to figure out, well, when is this design process going to be implemented for our company? You really need to be thinking about planning at the very, very beginning. Start your planning activities earlier than you are. I haven't yet found a company that was planning too early. I don't think it's possible. You really need a plan, but you don't have to have all the detail. Don't get paralyzed by analysis in the planning process. Come up with a simple plan and add detail to the plan over time. the plan is not frozen. The plan is a living document that you update over time. And the project does not end when you pass your VMV testing. That's what you submit to the FDA for your design in your 510K, but you're still not done. You need to make sure that you do design transfer activities. So you scale up from the prototypes that you did all your verification testing on to commercialization. And it's very common to only be working on prototype parts for your VMV testing and have to repeat some of that testing. So even though we say we're going to do a design freeze because we don't want to redo any testing, honestly, you're probably going to redo testing 2, 3 times anyway as you go through the design transfer and scale up. You just don't want to do it 3 or 4 times. So you have to do it twice, maybe because you're going to have your prototypes and then your commercial version. You don't need to add another version because you change your spec halfway through the verification testing. So make sure that you thought about design transfer activities and scale up and automation, and maybe going to a new vendor, maybe multiple source vendors now that we have supply chain issues globally. And then regulatory clearance. It's not a one thing. It's not, oh, I got 510K clearance and I'm done. A lot of companies want to go global. So they have CE marking, Canadian licensing, approval in China. Mexican authorities have given them a license. All these different countries that you want to launch in, each one has its own regulatory approval process. So when people ask me, well, how do you maintain your design history file? The only country that actually defines design history file is the FDA, and they defined it back in 1996. So the advice is you open it when you decide, oh, this new project needs design controls. So I come up with a plan and I start the file. And I finish the file when I get regulatory clearance from the FDA because they're the only ones asking for this. Now, I also have a device master record. That's the current version. So after I've gotten regulatory approval from the FDA, now every single time I make a change, I update my DMR and I keep a running revision history of the DMR changes. That's much more like a technical file that you would have in Europe or in Canada or in Australia. So that's the model I use. Design history file is not the same as a technical file. The design history file has a beginning and it has an end, whereas the device master record is a living document and the technical file is a living document. And they've confused things a little bit lately with the introduction of a medical device file. But the concept was they were trying to say, we don't have anywhere in 1345 where we talked about files that have to be maintained. So let's introduce this concept of a medical device file because that'll cover technical files in Europe and technical files in Australia and Canada. And it will also cover the DHF, but there are different requirements in different countries. They're not all the same thing. So it's actually causing more confusion because people think it's one thing and it's many things. So those are really important to think of. The success of your design process is you've passed verification and validation testing. Your end of your design control process is when you go through design transfer and you get regulatory approval. But once again, every single time you make a change, you start the process over again. And the question is, do I start from scratch with a new plan and a new design history file, or am I just going to repeat some of my testing more like the iterative process that occurs in the middle of design and development? And it's an abbreviated design process that I can document on maybe a change control with a letter to file. So I hope that helps you understand how design has changed over the time since 1996. Helps you appreciate that a lot of these standards that you have now didn't exist back then, and gives you a better appreciation for a more comprehensive definition of what design controls is. It's not just plan, inputs, outputs, verification, validation. It's much more than that. It's I need to be thinking about um, I have a collection of methods, not just design controls. I have human factors, I have software, I have usability, I have all these different standards. I have many team members, many companies involved. I have needs that are other than just the user's needs. I have customer needs, regulators needs, standards requirements, and stakeholders. And then finally, I have a whole bunch of different standards that didn't exist back then. So I'm going to have my team be trained on risk, usability, software, and design controls just to get them off the starting line. And then we're going to have to bring in some help. I hope that was helpful to everybody. And if you have any suggestions for future topics, please let me know. But next week's 12:30 Eastern time on Friday, we're going to be talking about lead auditors. So I'll be putting up a new topic for you on the website, but it's going to be lead auditors next week. Thank you, everybody. Have a great weekend. Bye bye.